The silence was suffocating. Anne Frank sat near the small curtained window of the Secret Annex, her diary resting on her lap, her fingers curled around its worn edges. The morning air was heavy, the walls damp with the scent of too many people living in too little space. Outside, the city of Amsterdam stirred to life. Bicycles rattling over cobblestone streets, distant church bells marking the hour, the low murmur of conversations drifting through the narrow alleyways. For 2 years she had listened to these sounds, sounds of a world she could no longer touch. But this morning was different. There was a tension in the air, a feeling of something unseen pressing against the walls of the annex. Anne's father, Otto, sat stiffly in his chair pretending to read. Edith Frank moved about the cramped space with mechanical precision, her hands folding and unfolding the same dish towel. Margot, always composed, sat quietly, staring at nothing. From the attic, Peter paced, his footsteps slow, deliberate, barely making a sound. They all felt it, a strange, unspoken sense of impending doom. Anne's pulse quickened. She looked down at the diary in her hands, its pages filled with the only version of herself that the world knew. The Anne who wrote in its pages was more than just a girl in hiding. She was a storyteller, a dreamer, a voice that refused to be silenced. Would anyone ever read her words? Would they understand her? She inhaled sharply, forcing the thoughts away. Not today, not yet. Then, a noise. Not the usual creak of the wooden beams above or the distant hum of traffic. Something sharper, louder, closer. A footstep on the stairs, then another, then a voice. German, clipped, commanding, unfamiliar. Her breath caught in her throat. The others in the annex heard it too. Otto's eyes lifted from his book. Edith's hands stopped moving. Margot turned, her face pale. Peter froze mid-step. Then, the knock. Loud, sharp, final. Anne's heart slammed against her ribs. A second knock, then a third, then voices. More footsteps. The scraping of the bookshelf moving aside. And then, for the first time in over 2 years, the doorway to the outside world was open again. A figure stepped through the narrow entrance. A uniformed officer, a gun at his hip, a hard expression carved into his face. Anne's fingers curled around the edges of her diary. This couldn't be the end, but deep down, she knew. The walls that had kept them safe had now become a tomb. As she was pulled to her feet, her diary slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a dull thud, its pages fluttering open. She didn't reach for it. She didn't look back, because she already knew. She was leaving it behind, but her words, they would remain. Anne Frank was born into a world on the brink of change. On June 12, 1929, in the city of Frankfurt, Germany, she entered a country that had yet to fully recover from the devastation of the First World War. The scars of the past were still fresh, lingering in the crumbling economy and political instability that gripped the Weimar Republic. Her parents, Otto and Edith Frank, were part of a long-established German Jewish community. The Franks were not deeply religious, but they observed Jewish traditions and holidays, celebrating their faith in a quiet and dignified manner. Otto, a World War I veteran, had served his country with loyalty and pride, believing in the values of the German nation. His family had been well off for generations with ties to the banking and business industries. The Franks lived a comfortable middle-class life in Frankfurt. They resided in a spacious apartment at Marbachweg 307, located in a peaceful neighborhood where Anne and her older sister Margot spent their early years. The girls grew up surrounded by books, music, and education, values their parents deeply instilled in them. But outside their home, the world was shifting. The Germany Anne was born into was still reeling from the effects of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 at the end of World War I. The treaty had imposed severe restrictions on Germany, crippling its military, demanding massive financial reparations, and causing widespread resentment among its people. The Weimar Republic, the fragile democratic government that replaced the German Empire, struggled to maintain stability. By the time Anne was born, economic hardship had become a defining feature of life in Germany. In 1923, just 6 years before her birth, the country had suffered from one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history. Prices soared so high that a loaf of bread which had cost a few marks before the war suddenly required millions of marks to purchase. People carried wheelbarrows of money just to buy basic necessities. Though the economy had temporarily stabilized by 1929, the Great Depression, which began in October of that year, plunged Germany back into turmoil. Businesses collapsed, banks failed, and unemployment skyrocketed. Families that had once lived comfortably found themselves destitute, standing in long lines for food. Against this backdrop of economic despair, a new political movement was rising, one that would forever alter the course of Anne Frank's life. As Anne was learning to walk and speak in her early years, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, or Nazi Party, were gaining momentum. Hitler, a charismatic speaker and a veteran of World War I, tapped into the anger and desperation of the German people. He blamed Germany's suffering on its enemies, particularly Jews, communists, and the politicians who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. By 1930, the Nazi Party had become the second largest political party in Germany. Their anti-Semitic rhetoric grew louder, spreading dangerous conspiracy theories that accused Jewish people of controlling banks, manipulating the economy, and betraying Germany in World War I. For the Franks, this shift in politics was deeply concerning. Otto, an intelligent and well-read man, followed the growing wave of anti-Semitism with unease. Though their family had lived in Germany for generations, Otto knew that history had often turned against Jewish communities in times of crisis. Then, in January 1933, everything changed. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It was a moment that, at the time, many Germans did not fully comprehend. To some, Hitler was merely another politician in a long line of unstable leaders. But to those who paid attention, those like Otto Frank, it was clear that a storm was coming. Within months, Hitler's government began eroding democracy. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave the Nazis an excuse to suspend civil liberties and begin their crackdown on political opposition. Newspapers critical of the Nazis were shut down. Communist and socialist leaders were arrested. Most chillingly for Jewish families like the Franks, Hitler's government enacted the first anti-Jewish laws. Jews were slowly pushed out of public life, banned from government jobs, restricted from certain professions, and targeted by violent propaganda. The once proud Germany that Otto Frank had served as a soldier was disappearing before his eyes. In April 1933, just 3 months into Hitler's rule, Jewish businesses began facing boycotts organized by Nazi forces. Stormtroopers, SA, stood outside Jewish-owned stores, marking them with Stars of David and warning Germans not to shop there. For Otto and Edith Frank, the message was clear. They had to leave. Though Otto Frank was a proud German, he was also a pragmatic man. He saw what many others refused to acknowledge. Hitler's rule was not temporary. Things would not get better. With anti-Semitism intensifying, Otto began making arrangements to leave Germany. He reached out to contacts in the Netherlands, where business opportunities seemed promising. In the summer of 1933, he secured a job managing the Dutch branch of Apecta, a company that produced pectin, a key ingredient in making jams and jellies. By late 1933, Otto moved to Amsterdam, Netherlands, to establish a new home. He spent months settling in, arranging housing, and preparing for his family's arrival. Then, in December 1933, Edith Frank and Margot followed. Anne, still a toddler, remained in Germany a little longer. She was cared for by her grandmother, Alice Frank, in Aachen, a city near the Dutch border. It wasn't until February 1934, when she was nearly 5 years old, that Anne and her grandmother joined the rest of the Frank family in Amsterdam. For the Franks, the Netherlands seemed like a safe haven. The country had a history of tolerance and Jewish refugees were not yet being persecuted there. The family settled into a modest apartment on WWII, a quiet, middle-class neighbourhood in the southern part of the city. Anne, still too young to fully understand why they had left Germany, adjusted quickly to her new life. She began school, made friends, and developed an early passion for reading and storytelling. She would spend hours buried in books, fascinated by the worlds they created. For a time, it seemed like the Franks had escaped the worst. But history was not finished with them. When Anne Frank arrived in Amsterdam in February 1934, she was not yet 5 years old. For her, the move was not marked by the fear and uncertainty that burdened her parents. It was an adventure. The Netherlands offered a fresh start, and for a while it seemed like a place where she and her family could live in peace. Unlike in Germany, where the Nazi Party's rise had made Jewish families feel increasingly unwelcome, Amsterdam was a city known for its tolerance and diversity. Jewish refugees from across Europe were settling there, and Dutch society, despite its divisions, was relatively accepting. The Frank family was safe, for now. The Franks settled in Merwedeplein, a residential neighbourhood in southern Amsterdam. Their new apartment was modest but comfortable, located in a 4-story brick building with wide streets and open courtyards where children played. It was a world away from the turmoil unfolding in Germany. Anne's older sister, Margot, was a quiet and studious child, known for her discipline and intelligence. Anne, on the other hand, was energetic, outspoken, and full of curiosity. She had an imaginative mind, a natural inclination towards storytelling, and an endless stream of questions. Even at a young age, she was known for her sharp wit and ability to talk her way out of trouble. The Franks quickly adjusted to Dutch life. Otto Frank took charge of a pector, a company that sold pectin, an ingredient used for making jam. He worked tirelessly to ensure his family's stability, often commuting by bicycle across the city. Edith, who had struggled emotionally with leaving Germany, devoted herself to caring for Margot and Anne, maintaining a sense of normalcy in their new home. Though German remained the primary language spoken in their household, Anne and Margot soon became fluent in Dutch. They began attending school, integrating into a society that, at least for now, allowed them to live without fear. In 1934, Anne was enrolled at the Montessori School of Amsterdam, a progressive institution that focused on creativity, independent thinking, and hands-on learning. The school's philosophy suited her perfectly. Unlike Margot, who excelled in structure and discipline, Anne thrived in an environment that encouraged imagination and expression. Her teachers quickly recognized her gift for storytelling. Even as a child, Anne would craft elaborate tales, entertaining her classmates with dramatic reenactments. She was mischievous and loved being the center of attention, often talking too much in class, something that would later be reflected in the pages of her diary. Despite her energetic nature, Anne was also highly sensitive. She felt emotions deeply, whether it was frustration, joy, or sadness. If she had an argument with a friend, she would write about it in detail, analyzing what went wrong. She could be stubborn, opinionated, and even temperamental, but she was also kind, affectionate, and fiercely loyal to the people she cared about. Her closest friend at this time was Hannelie Goslar, a German Jewish girl who had also fled the Nazi regime with her family. The two were inseparable, spending afternoons playing in the courtyards of Merwedeplein, riding bicycles through the neighborhood, and imagining fantastic worlds where they were the heroines of their own stories. For Anne, Amsterdam felt like home. She was too young to remember much of their life in Germany, and in her mind, the Netherlands was where she belonged. But the dark shadow that had forced her family to flee was still looming, growing larger with each passing year. By the late 1930s, the world outside Amsterdam was changing at an alarming pace. Adolf Hitler's Third Reich was no longer confined to Germany. In March 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. That same year, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding control of the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. For Otto Frank, these developments were deeply troubling. He had always hoped that Hitler's influence would remain contained within Germany, but now it was clear that Europe was on the path to war. The Franks, like many other Jewish refugees, were increasingly trapped. They had left Germany in time, but with every country that fell to the Nazis, their options for escape dwindled. Then, in November 1938, came Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Across Germany and Austria, Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked. Over 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, marking a clear escalation in Nazi persecution. Even though the Franks were hundreds of miles away, the news of Kristallnacht shook them to their core. It was a warning. Things would only get worse. Otto began seeking ways to get his family out of Europe altogether. He applied for US visas in 1938 and again in 1941, but restrictive immigration policies and bureaucratic delays meant that they were never approved. The Franks were effectively stuck in the Netherlands, hoping against hope that the war would not reach them. Hans' carefree childhood in Amsterdam came to an abrupt end on May 10, 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army fought back, but after only 5 days of resistance, the country surrendered. On May 14th, the Germans bombed the city of Rotterdam, killing nearly 900 people and leaving tens of thousands homeless. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government fled to Britain, leaving the country under German occupation. Anne was only 10 years old, but she immediately sensed that something had changed. The first few months of occupation were not as harsh as they had been in Germany. Many Dutch citizens believed that life would continue relatively normally under Nazi rule. But for Jewish families like the Franks, the warning signs were clear. The new government, under direct Nazi control, began implementing anti-Jewish measures almost immediately. Summer 1940, Jewish civil servants were dismissed from their jobs. October 1940, Jewish businesses, including Otto Frank's Opekta, were forced to register with the authorities. 1941, Jewish students were expelled from public schools. Anne, who had thrived at her Montessori school, was forced to leave and attend an all-Jewish school. Her teachers and classmates changed overnight. Margot, who had been excelling academically, faced the same restrictions. For the first time in her life, Anne felt the weight of discrimination. Anne Frank awoke to the sound of hushed voices. It was July 6, 1942, a day that would forever divide her life into before and after. The night before, her parents had sat her down and explained what was happening. The Nazis had sent a deportation order for Margot. The letter had arrived on July 5th, instructing her to report for labor duty in Germany. But everyone knew the truth. Jews who were taken away never returned. The Franks had no time to hesitate. The plan that Otto Frank had been quietly preparing for months now had to be executed overnight. Anne, barely 13 years old, packed what little she could. The family could carry nothing that would raise suspicion, so they stuffed essential belongings into school bags and wore multiple layers of clothing, despite the summer heat. She grabbed her most treasured possession, her diary. They couldn't take suitcases. They couldn't say goodbye to friends. They simply disappeared. At 5:30 a.m., before the city was fully awake, Otto, Edith, Margot and Anne left their apartment on Merwedplein for the last time. They walked in silence, their breaths shallow, their footsteps careful. Public trams rattled by. Bicycles clicked on the cobblestone streets. No one knew they were leaving forever. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached 263 Prinsengracht, the office of Otto Frank's company, Opekta. From the outside, it looked like any other building along Amsterdam's canals. But hidden inside was the annex that would become their entire world. The entrance was concealed behind a movable bookshelf, a feature that would later become infamous. Otto's employees, Victor Kugler, Johannes Kleiman, Miep Gies, and Bep Voskuil, had helped him prepare the hideout. The space itself was cramped and stifling. The annex consisted of several small rooms, all connected by narrow hallways and steep staircases. It was a prison disguised as a home. Anne and Margot shared a room, cold, sparse, with a single window that was always covered. Otto and Edith had their own room, though it barely fit a bed. The Van Pels family, Herman, Augusta, and their son Peter, arrived a week later, cramming into the small space. A year later, a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer joined them, making the annex feel even smaller. For 2 years, this would be their world. No running outside, no fresh air, no laughter echoing in the streets. Only whispers, shadows, and silence. Anne quickly learned that hiding was a constant battle against discovery. The smallest mistake could mean death, not just for them, but for those helping them. From 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., when employees worked below, they had to remain absolutely silent. No talking. No flushing the toilet. No walking too loudly. If the floor creaked, it could be heard downstairs. If someone dropped something, it could alert a worker. Anne's world shrank into a routine of strict survival. Dawn. Wake up in silence, listening to the city awaken beyond the covered windows. Morning. Read, study, or write. The sound of typewriters below meant the employees had arrived. Midday. When the workers took lunch breaks outside, they could move a little more freely. Evening. The office emptied, and for a brief time, they could whisper, stretch, and listen to the radio. Every creak of the floor, every unexpected noise sent terror through their bones. With nothing but time and nowhere to go, Anne turned to her diary. She named it Kitty, treating it as a friend, a confidant, a place where her voice could exist freely. Her first entries reflected boredom, frustration, and loneliness. She wrote of fights with her mother, annoyances with the Van Pels family, and her growing feelings for Peter. But as months passed, her diary became something more, a testament to her existence. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a writer, her fears of being caught, her longing to run, to dance, to feel sunlight on her skin. Her words transformed over time. At first, she was just a child trapped in a nightmare. But by 1943, her diary reflected a young woman grappling with war identity and survival. She wrote about the atrocities happening beyond the annex walls, the deportations, the starvation, the sounds of gunfire in the streets. She knew the world was crumbling, even if she couldn't see it. As the months dragged on, life in the annex became more desperate. The war outside was worsening and food was growing scarce. Miep and the others risked their lives to bring ration supplies, but even with their help, the annex was constantly on the edge of starvation. Bread became harder to find. Potatoes were often rotten or covered in mold. Sometimes all they had was watery soup and scraps of vegetables. Anne wrote of hunger gnawing at her stomach, of cold winter nights where they huddled under thin blankets, of the quiet despair of watching the world turn against them. By 1944, the sounds of Allied bombers filled the Amsterdam skies. Anne dreamed of freedom. She wrote about the future, of going back to school, becoming a journalist, living again. But deep down, she knew. She wrote one of her final entries on August 1st, 1944. I keep trying to find a way to become what I'd like to be and what I could be, if only there were no other people in the world. 3 days later, the annex was betrayed. On the morning of August 4th, 1944, the unthinkable happened. At 10:30 a.m., a car pulled up outside 263 Prinsengracht. SS officer Karl Silberbauer, along with several Dutch police officers, entered the building. Someone had tipped them off. The bookshelf was moved aside. Light poured into the dark annex. And then, silence. Otto Frank was the first to stand. He raised his hands, surrendering without a word. Anne, Margot, Edith, Herman, August, and Peter Van Pels. Fritz Pfeffer. All 8 were arrested. Their crime, being Jewish. As they were marched downstairs, Anne turned back, one last glance at the place that had been her home. Her diary remained behind. The streets of Amsterdam were silent as the police led Anne Frank and the others away from the only home they had known for the past 2 years. The Franks, the Van Pels family, and Fritz Pfeffer were forced into trucks that rumbled through the cobbled streets, heading toward Utrechtstraat, the headquarters of the Nazi security service, Sicherheitsdienst, SD, in Amsterdam. For 2 years, they had lived in the shadows, confined to whispering, hiding behind a bookshelf, avoiding the outside world. Now the outside world had swallowed them whole. Upon arrival at Utrechtstraat, they were separated and interrogated. The officers, led by SS Karl Silberbauer, wanted to know who had helped them. But Otto Frank, ever the protector, refused to reveal anything. The helpers, Miep Gies and the others, had not been arrested. Miep would later recall watching helplessly as Anne and the others were taken away, unable to save them. After a night in custody, Anne and the others were transferred to Wetteringschans prison, a facility used for political prisoners. They weren't placed in regular cells. They were sent directly to a holding area for Jews, awaiting transport to the next stage of their nightmare. On August 8, 1944, they were taken to Westerbork transit camp. The journey to Westerbork was short but humiliating. They were packed into cattle cars, crammed shoulder to shoulder with other prisoners, the stench of fear and sweat filling the air. When they arrived at Westerbork, they were no longer hiding Jews. They were prisoners. Westerbork was not a death camp, but it was a gateway to one. It was the final stop before Jews were sent east, to Auschwitz, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, and other Nazi extermination camps. Anne and the others were placed in the punishment barracks, a brutal section of the camp for those who had been caught in hiding. The conditions were wretched, overcrowding. The barracks held hundreds of people in spaces meant for far fewer. Filth and disease, lice and fleas infested the wooden bunks and illness spread quickly. Forced labour. Prisoners were forced to work for the Nazis, dismantling batteries, sorting confiscated goods, or working in miserable factories. Anne, only 13, was thrown into a world of hunger, exhaustion and despair. Yet, she still had her family. Margot stayed close to her, and Otto did everything he could to protect his daughters from the horrors around them. Anne clung to her father, the one figure of stability in a world that had become unrecognisable. The worst part of Westerbork wasn't the work, the filth, or even the hunger. It was the transports. Every Tuesday, trains left Westerbork, bound for the east. The prisoners knew what that meant. The whispers travelled through the barracks, Auschwitz, Sobibor, death. Anne watched families disappear, knowing their fate but unable to stop it. Then, on September 3, 1944, it was their turn. Anne Frank, her family, the Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer were forced onto a train. It was the last train that would ever leave Westerbork for Auschwitz. It was a 3-day journey, packed into cattle cars, with no food, no water and barely any air to breathe. The train carried over 1,000 people, and no one knew what awaited them, but they feared the worst. Anne held onto her father's hand, whispering to Margot, trying to stay strong. But the fear was suffocating. After 3 days, the train slowed. A sharp whistle pierced the air. Then came the shouting, "Out! Out!" The gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau loomed before them. Anne stumbled onto the platform, blinded by the sudden light, choking on the stench of burning flesh. This was Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most notorious extermination camp of the Holocaust. They were met by SS guards and Dr. Josef Mengele, the man who decided who lived and who died, women and children to the left, men to the right. Otto Frank was ripped away from his family. Anne screamed for him, but there was nothing he could do. He would never see his wife or daughters again. Anne, Margot and Edith were not sent to the gas chambers immediately. They were selected for forced labour. The conditions in Auschwitz were beyond anything Anne had ever imagined. Shaved heads. Upon arrival, their hair was cut off, stripping them of their identity. Tattooed numbers. Unlike some prisoners, Anne and Margot were never tattooed, as they were marked for future transport. starvation. They were given watery soup and scraps of bread, never enough to satisfy the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs. Freezing temperatures. They had no warm clothes, only thin, tattered rags. At night, they huddled together for warmth, but the cold was relentless. Anne grew weaker. She coughed constantly, and her once bright eyes began to dim. But the worst was yet to come. In late October 1944, Anne and Margot were selected for transport to Bergen-Belsen, a camp in northern Germany. Edith Frank was left behind in Auschwitz. She would die of starvation in January 1945. Bergen-Belsen was not a gas chamber camp. It was a slow death camp. The conditions were horrific. Typhus spread uncontrollably, killing thousands. Bodies lay unburied, the smell of decay poisoning the air. Food rations were non-existent. Prisoners survived on scraps, grass and garbage. By February 1945, Margot was so weak that she could barely stand. One day, she fell from her bunk onto the freezing ground and didn't move. She died soon after. Anne, now 15, was alone. By March 1945, typhus had taken hold of her too. Weakened, starving, and without hope, Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen. She was 15 years old. Only a few weeks later, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen, but Anne, Margot, and millions of others were already gone. Anne Frank's diary had survived, but she had not. The war ended, but for Otto Frank, there was no celebration. On April 15, 1945, British soldiers liberated Bergen-Belsen, where Anne and Margot had perished just weeks before. The soldiers who entered the camp were met with a scene so horrific that many could barely comprehend what they were seeing. Thousands of corpses lay in heaps across the ground. Skeletal figures wandered aimlessly, and the stench of death was inescapable. But Otto Frank wasn't there. He was still in Auschwitz, unaware that his wife and daughters were already gone. 3 months before Bergen-Belsen was freed, Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. By then, most of the prisoners had been sent on death marches, forced to walk through the snow in sub-zero temperatures as the Nazis abandoned the camp. But Otto had been too weak to march. He, along with a few thousand others, had been left behind to die in the freezing cold. When the Soviets arrived on January 27, 1945, they found Otto barely clinging to life. He had lost over 50 pounds, his body nothing more than skin stretched over bone. The gates of Auschwitz were opened, and Otto, who had survived the worst horrors imaginable, stepped out into a world forever changed. But he had no idea if his wife and daughters had survived. For months, Otto Frank wandered through the wreckage of Europe, desperately searching for his family. From Auschwitz, he was taken east into Soviet-controlled Poland, where the liberated prisoners were given food and medical attention. Slowly, he regained his strength, but he refused to stay. He had to find Edith, Margot, and Anne. In May 1945, Otto boarded a train west, passing through the ruins of war-torn Germany. Cities lay in rubble, buildings reduced to charred skeletons, people searching through the wreckage of their former lives. By June, he reached Amsterdam, the city he had fled to 12 years earlier, hoping to escape Nazi terror. When he arrived at 263 Prinsengracht, he saw the building that had hidden them for 2 years. The office remained, the bookshelf still stood, but the annex was empty. The silence was unbearable. Otto refused to give up hope. He went to every refugee centre in the Netherlands. He scoured Red Cross lists of Holocaust survivors. He wrote letters to every camp he could think of, begging for information. Then, in July 1945, the news came. A former Dutch prisoner who had been at Auschwitz with Edith confirmed what Otto had feared the most. His wife had died of starvation in January 1945, weeks before liberation. Otto collapsed in grief, but he held on to hope for his daughters. Weeks later, another survivor from Bergen-Belsen returned to Amsterdam. Her name was Jannie Brandes Brillisleiper. She had been one of the last people to see Anne and Margot alive. When Otto found her, he could see the truth in her hollow, grief-stricken eyes before she even spoke. Anne and Margot were gone. They had died in March 1945, ravaged by typhus, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Otto Frank was now alone. Days after learning of Anne's death, Otto visited Miep Gies. Miep had been one of the brave helpers who had risked everything to keep the Franks alive. After the Gestapo had raided the annex, she had returned to the scene, stepping through the broken door, past the overturned furniture, and into the empty rooms. There, she had found Anne's diary, lying on the floor where it had been left. For nearly a year, she had kept it safe, hoping to return it to Anne. Now, with tears in her eyes, she handed it to Otto. This is Anne's legacy. Otto took the diary in shaking hands, tracing the cover with his fingers. For the first time since he had lost his family, he heard Anne's voice again, her words, her thoughts, her dreams. She was gone, but her story had survived. For months, Otto couldn't bring himself to read it. Every page was a reminder of what he had lost. But as he turned through the delicate pages, he saw a different Anne. Not just the child he had known, but a brilliant young woman, a thinker, a dreamer. One passage struck him more than any other. "I want to go on living even after my death." Anne had written those words less than a month before her arrest. Otto knew what he had to do. At first, no publisher was interested in printing a Jewish girl's diary. The world was still coming to terms with the horrors of the Holocaust, and many people wanted to forget rather than remember. But Otto refused to let Anne's voice be silenced. Through his persistence, Contact Publishing, a small Dutch company, agreed to print the diary in 1947. The first edition, titled Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was a modest publication. Only 3,000 copies were printed. Otto expected nothing. But within months, demand exploded. The Dutch edition sold out almost immediately. By 1950, translations were being prepared in French, German, and English. In 1952, the first English edition was released as The Diary of a Young Girl. Anne's words had begun to reach the world. By the 1960s, Anne Frank had become a symbol of hope and remembrance. In 1955, a Broadway play was made based on the diary. In 1959, a Hollywood film adaptation was released. By 1960, Otto Frank helped turn the annex into the Anne Frank House Museum. Millions of people from every corner of the world visited the place where Anne had written her final words of freedom. Otto Frank spent the rest of his life ensuring that Anne's message would never be forgotten. He had lost everything, but he had kept his promise to Anne. For over 30 years, Otto Frank dedicated his life to preserving Anne's memory. Even as he aged, he continued to speak at schools, attend memorial events, and ensure that Anne's voice reached new generations. In 1980, at the age of 91, Otto Frank passed away in Switzerland. He was the last living member of the Frank family, but Anne's words lived on. A legacy that echoes through time today, Anne Frank's diary is one of the most widely read books in history. It has been translated into over 70 languages. Over 30 million copies have been sold worldwide. The Anne Frank House receives over 1 million visitors every year. Anne had once dreamed of becoming a writer. She never lived to see it. But in death, she became one of the most important writers the world has ever known. Her voice did not die in Bergen-Belsen. It lives on, forever.